Using a table to synthesize information for a literature review. When you're writing a literature review, your objective is to describe and evaluate the collective knowledge related to your research topic or question. But it's not enough to summarize the information from your sources, you also need to synthesize it. When you synthesize information from various sources, you're trying to show your reader how the different pieces of information relate to each other. Are there multiple studies that have similar findings? Does one article build on the results of another? How do the findings in your sources complement or contradict one another? And how does all this information relate to your thesis or research question? You will need to understand the connections among the sources you use and communicate those connections to your reader. One way to visualize the connections between your sources is to create a synthesis table. It's nice to use a spreadsheet for this because you have an unlimited number of rows and columns. But you could also create a table in a document if you're more comfortable with that. Here's what a finished table might look like. I have a column for each source and a row for each of my themes. Themes are the central topics or subjects that appear in my sources, and as we'll see later, they usually come from the findings of the sources I use. In each cell, I have briefly described what each source has to say about each of my themes. You'll notice that there are a lot of empty cells because not every source speaks to each theme. Now that you've seen what the completed table looks like, let me show you how I filled it out. Let's say my research question is, what are the challenges faced by college students who are parents, and what can colleges do to support this group? I'm going to put that at the top of my spreadsheet to help me remember that the most important information from my sources will be information that helps me answer this question. I have 5 sources that I found on my topic that I want to use in my literature review. For most literature reviews, I would probably use quite a bit more than 5, but let's keep it simple for this example. As I'm reading my sources, I'm not going to use this spreadsheet to take detailed notes on them. For note-taking, I would probably use a document, a Zotero note, or a program that lets me annotate the article itself. When I'm done with my initial reading of a source, that's when I enter a summary of the main points into the synthesis table. I will start by creating a column for each source. I'm keeping the first column empty because that is where I'll put my themes. At this point, I may or may not know what those themes are. For this example, let's say that I don't yet know what my themes are, so part of my process will be figuring that out. After reading my first article by Dane et al., I'm going to take its findings, or at least the ones that relate to my research question, and put them in different rows. The findings are the new information that a source contributes to our collective understanding of a topic. And for scholarly articles, they're usually found in the results, discussion, or conclusions section. One of the findings of this study was that student parents didn't feel that they had enough information about the campus childcare center. So in this cell, I'm going to put my summary of this finding from my notes, which includes that the university didn't give enough information about childcare, that students would like this information when they are admitted, and that they would appreciate information about off-campus childcare options as well. Another finding from this study that I summarized in my notes was that many students who wanted to use the campus childcare weren't able to because it was full, too expensive, or not open at the right times. I'll put that in another row. Other important findings were that student parents can experience stress or depression from balancing school and family, and that other support services are needed, such as study areas, family events, and support groups. My next article is by Kenziger and Minnick. I'm going to take the findings from this article and see whether any of them have a similar focus to the findings of the previous article. One of their findings is that a lack of reliable childcare is a barrier to completing college, and that the campus childcare center is too expensive for some students. I think that relates to the finding of the previous article, that students wanted to use the campus childcare, but weren't able to due to cost and availability. So I'll put this finding in the same row. They also had some findings related to the lack of awareness of campus childcare and other services, so I'll include that in the first row, since it's similar to the finding from the previous article in that same row. Something else that came up in this article is that many student parents felt discriminated against or judged. That doesn't obviously relate to any of the findings from the previous article, so I'm going to put it in a new row. Finally, there was another piece I thought was important about how student parents miss class or work, or even withdraw from classes due to lack of childcare. I'll create a new row for that one too. After I do the same thing with the rest of my sources, here's how my table looks. As I was filling out the findings from the remaining articles, I had to decide whether each had a similar focus to any of the findings from the previous articles, or whether to put it in a new row. Now that all the findings from the sources are grouped together in rows, I'm going to look at each row to determine the focus of those findings, and then create a name for the theme that describes that focus. All of the findings that I've put in the first row have to do with the awareness of campus childcare and other services that are available to student parents. I'm going to call that theme Awareness of Resources. In the second row, I see findings that relate to how expensive childcare is, other reasons why it's not easily accessible for student parents, and that its availability can factor into student decisions to attend a particular school. I'll call that theme Availability and Affordability of Childcare. The third row was a lot trickier for me. I initially had these three findings in different rows because their connections to each other were not immediately apparent. One has to do with feeling stress or depression around balancing family and school. One has to do with perceived discrimination against student parents. And one has to do with campuses ignoring the childcare responsibilities of students and signaling to them that they're on their own to deal with it. As I kept looking at my table, though, I started to realize that they are all connected in the sense that they are psychological challenges faced by student parents. And so I moved them all to the same row and named the theme. The findings in the fourth row are that a lack of childcare causes student parents to miss class or work or withdraw from courses, that students who use on-campus childcare believe that it's very important in helping them achieve their educational goals, and that students with children 6 and older have greater motivation and goal attainment than those with younger children. I can see that all of these have to do with how parenting or childcare impacts educational goals, so that will be my label for this theme. The final row's findings are related in that they are about campus support services other than childcare. Not all of the findings from all of my sources made it into this final table. I initially put them all in here to see how they related to each other, but I ended up taking out some findings that I decided weren't sufficiently relevant to my research question. You might find that some of your sources don't have any relevant findings, which is why it's good to start out with more sources than are required for your assignment. Or you might end up with more themes than you can address in your literature review, in which case you might decide to limit the scope of your literature review to just the themes that you think are the most important or most relevant to your topic. Now that my table is completed, I'm ready to start writing my literature review. I'll organize it by theme and use the table to see which sources speak to each theme and how their findings are connected.